Welcome to the Hotsheet. Today's guest is one of the most influential documentary filmmakers of our time, Joe Berlinger. From Brothers Keeper, Paradise Lost, to Metallica's Some Kind of Monster, and the Netflix landmark series Conversations with a Killer. Joe's work has helped redefine storytelling as a vehicle of truth and social justice. Before we begin, please subscribe. It's the best way to support conversations like this. Now let's get to it.
Welcome to the Hot Sheet, Joe Berlinger. We are
Welcome.
so excited to have you on the show.
Nice
And
to be on the show. It's nice to see
it's,
you after all these years, Jen.
I know I've known you a very long time. I mean, I'm a big fan of your work, from Brothers Keeper, the Sundance hit, to the epic trilogy Paradise Lost, where you got nominated for an Academy Award. Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, I think reading for that. Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, and all your recent Netflix hits with Cold Case, JonBenét, Who Killed JonBenét, and Conversations with the Killer, Ted Bundy. And that's just like a few of the things that you've done over your career. But it's all I can remember. But I want
somehow they keep employing me.
Well, there's one thing I do want to get straight. Okay, I've did little homework on you, and I hadn't realized this before, but Bloomberg called you a true crime hit factory. And I know you kind of wince at that moniker, and I want to start by asking you, like, what does that mean to you? What is the true crime genre? How did you get your start here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have an uneasy relationship, with the phrase true crime. When people call me a true crime pioneer or give credit to Brothers Keeper and Paradise Lost for kind of helping to instigate the genre of true crime, of course, I like that praise, but the phrase itself, true crime, I think has a lot of baggage because there's, actually, I would describe myself as a social justice documentarian who has spent a lot of time in the criminal justice space, as opposed to a true crime guy. But I guess, that's what people like to call it. But the problem I have, there's basically two kinds of true crime. There's very salacious content that really is not intended to do anything other than to wallow in the misery of others, to tell a story. No social justice mission to move a needle on a case like wrongful conviction, or, even my serial killer stuff has identified new victims of serial killers. So there's great, intelligent, crime-focused content that has existed for decades. Thin Blue Line with Errol Morris is also a foundational film. But there's a lot of true crime that is just super irresponsible, irreverent in tone. There's so I'm uneasy with the true crime moniker because the market is very bifurcated. There's intelligent investigatory stuff in the crime space, and then there's stuff that just kind of forgets that there's victims out there and it exists to tell a story. And while it's okay to enjoy a story as a consumer, you always have to remember that this is somebody's worst day of their life or the worst day of their family's life. And so I always ask myself before I start a project, what needle can I move? What reason is there to tell this story besides just, because for most viewers, it's a story and I watch it and I click to the next show and it's over. But again, for most people, for the subjects of these stories, I shouldn't say most people, this is the worst day of their life. So to honor that, you have to find some reason to tell the story. So yes, I'm a true crime guy, but there's two buckets of true crime, and I think my work exists in the more intelligent, more social justice oriented, bucket.
I love that. I mean, I think, and going back to your Brother's Keeper film, isn't brother's keeper isn't like a biblical term for looking out for your fellow person. Look out for each other. Like brother, you're the brother's keeper. Like there's something I was thinking about that today. Like, wow, your first big film was this epic Sundance hit and about this wrongfully convicted murder up in upstate New York.
Yeah.
And the title I think has been like thematic for you because you have been kind of a brother's keeper. You have done a service to all the stories, um, all the victims of these stories over the years, and not, like you said, not just milking the entertainment part of it, but really finding a meaning into it, especially with, Paradise Lost and that whole epic journey.
Yeah. I mean, I like that reference to Brother's Keeper. It is a quote from Genesis. And yes, am I my brother's keeper is kind of the theme of it. Obviously, it was very related to the content of the film because one brother was, we had these 4 dairy farming brothers. 2 of them slept in the same bed together. One was accused of murdering the other. The question that animated the film, was it a mercy killing? Was it not a killing at all? Because this guy had a very simple, low IQ, very simple, illiterate person who signed a confession saying he did it, even though everyone around him said he didn't understand what he was signing. But yes, and in fact, I'm very proud of Brothers Keeper. Of course, I made that with Bruce Sinofsky, who sadly passed away a decade ago. Bruce, you remember Bruce.
Yeah.
So, that was an incredible adventure. I was like 28 at the time. I think Bruce was 4.5 years older than me. So he's in his early 30s. But, that film was made in an era, where, docs were not what they are today. If you weren't selling your documentary to HBO or PBS back then, you weren't selling your documentary. There was no such thing as such
There were 2 outlets.
docu-series as we know them today were very few and far between, and also we specifically wanted to make a documentary for the movie theaters. So back then, pre-digital, if you wanted your documentary to be shown in a movie theater, you had to originate on celluloid. So even though video was available, we chose, and we were no budget filmmakers with no support of any kind. And back then, a roll of 16 millimeter film, by the time you bought the roll of film, shot it, sent it to the lab, took your 1/4-inch Nagra tape because sound was on a different machine, send that to a different lab. Then you get a week later, you get your work print on 16 millimeter and you get your 1/4-inch tape converted to a 16 millimeter, sound mags reel so that you can then sync it up and look at it on your Moviola or Steenbeck a week later. Every 10 minutes cost you $400. So back in 1990, when you're deciding to make a documentary and you're nobodies and you have no budget, choosing to shoot on film was a very considered decision. But we wanted to make this experience for a movie theater, and you had to originate on celluloid so that you could then cut a negative and print celluloid, pre-digital.
Oh my
So
gosh.
anyway, so we're very proud of that film. And yes, the theme of that film was this guy never should have been brought into the criminal justice system. And, that concern has animated, a good portion of my career. In Brothers Keeper, the system kind of worked and the guy was acquitted at the end. In Paradise Lost, it was kind of the inverse of that, a rush to judgment, the worst of the community, whereas in Brothers Keeper, the community was incredibly positive and thought the guys were innocent. In Paradise Lost, just the opposite. So Paradise Lost, I would say, is more where, I think Brothers Keeper was more of an aesthetic experience. Bruce and I wanted to make a film that could play in movie theaters, that could help expand the definition of what is documentary. Because in the 80s, with obvious exceptions like Barbara Koppel and other people still doing verite, the Maisels, although David Maisels had passed away, for the most part, documentary in the 80s had become, you know, talking head, archival footage, PBS historical stuff. Not to bash Ken Burns, because I love his work and he's the master at what he does. In fact, he has this new series out on the American Revolution that I can't wait to see. But that
Yeah.
Civil War approach to documentary really was what most documentaries were in the late 80s, early 90s. And what was interesting about that era was that there was a bunch of us all experimenting with the form, not like we were a school who were talking to each other, but it just kind of, the late 80s, early 90s was an explosion in people experimenting with the form of documentary to make it more uh, entertaining, for lack of a better word, to make it more accessible than just PBS. You had Michael Moore, who put himself on camera for the first time in Roger and Me.
Right.
That was the first time, and then Morgan Spurlock and others emulated that approach of filmmaker as social warrior, and he put himself on camera. Errol Morris, Errol Morris with Thin Blue Line that came out in '89. He was the first filmmaker to use recreations in a documentary. So that was
Wow.
big. That was a new way of expanding the definition. And I think we chose a murder trial for Brothers Keeper, not because of some social justice concern, but rather, and this is the secret to true crime from an aesthetic standpoint, true crime gives you perfect dramatic structure. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. Every definition of what is drama is encapsulated by crime, because you have an antagonist and a protagonist vying for the truth, and then they're changed at the end of the show or movie. um, Rising and falling action. uh, it's just there's an inciting incident, a search for the perpetrator, and hopefully justice at the end, or a lack of justice. So what we were trying to do is to follow in the footsteps of the Maisel brothers, but even push it further to make a documentary that had all the good qualities of fiction film, because the Maisels would tell you they didn't direct their films. There's no such thing as directors. That direct cinema verite was just objective reality. And while I greatly owe a debt to them for the art of verite and capturing things as they unfold, I completely disagree. I think all filmmaking is very subjective. You have directors and you make a million subjective choices when you make a film, even a documentary. You're there to present the emotional truth of a situation, not just the literal truth. And that involves a lot of subjective decisions. So I think our contribution in the early 90s with Brothers Keeper, and there are a lot of younger filmmakers, Morgan Spurlock, who I mentioned already, sadly he passed as well, Simon
Yeah.
Kilmurray, Brett Morgan. So many filmmakers have told me that that was the film that made them want to become filmmakers, because we really were
Wow.
consciously focusing on dramatic structure and doing crazy things at the time, like now are so commonplace. And when I say them, you'll go like, well, duh, that's obvious. But it wasn't obvious back then. We did things like an original music score in our documentary,
I
which
saw that.
that
I was looking at the credits and I was like, they had music in that
and
film.
a
I
lot
forgot about that.
and the then vanguard of documentarians all criticize, like, how can you have a music score throughout the entire film? That's manipulative. that 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 tells you what to think. It's not journalism. We also had this really compelling opening title sequence in Brothers Keeper, like a true title sequence with creepy shots of the bed, and it's very tame and by the way, I'm not saying I invented these things. Other people were doing it too. But, the opening title sequence was very tame by comparison, um, to what you have today. But we were critical. Well, you can't have that's a scripted technique, it takes away from your journalism. So what I what I think Brothers Keeper represented was Bruce and I were consciously trying to emulate the fine qualities of a fiction film while still being truthful. Like, you have a certain responsibility in documentary. You can't put words into people's mouths or Frankenbite something that's not what it's supposed to be or whatever. So of course we're still playing by the rules of journalism, but we're
Right.
pushing the form to give it some dramatic structure. Other filmmakers like Jenny Livingston in that era, Paris is Burning, putting people on screen that you don't normally see in movies. So it was a very late 80s, early 90s was a very fertile period of documentary, and Brothers Keeper, I don't think was the film that where I thought, okay, social justice, particularly in the crime space, is my thing. It was more of an aesthetic choice. When Paradise Lost came out, that was the film when we're filming that final scene in Paradise Lost where Jason and Damien are being chained up and being led off to, one to death row, one life without parole, and the Jesse Miskelly, the third one, had already been sent to life without parole. He had a separate trial. But when we were filming this final scene in the back room where they were being chained up, we both just felt like, oh my God, we've just witnessed the greatest miscarriage of justice, and we're sitting on this footage that could help right this wrong. So it was the making of that film where I really feel like, wow. I mean, it was a baptism by fire. Like, I didn't know things like false confessions existed. Neither did most of the American public, but that's where we learned about false confessions in Paradise Lost. That's where I learned that, hey, you can get put on death row for something you didn't do. I mean, that trial was a total joke. There was no physical evidence linking them to the crime. Um,
How did you
so,
get that? How did you get on to Paradise Lost? Like, how did you go to Arkansas and start filming the trial? Like, how did that come about?
well, interestingly, it was the film started off as us thinking we were making a film about guilty teenagers. Sheila Nevins at HBO was a fan of Brothers Keeper, and she saw an article in the New York Times about these three devil worshipping teens who had just been arrested for these child murders, where the three 8-year-olds had been taken out into the backwoods of Arkansas and sacrificed to the devil. All the press down there was saying that they were guilty. The police chief was going on TV saying on a scale of 1 to 10, the evidence is an 11. So
Whoa.
Sheila ripped that article out of the New York Times, put it in an interoffice memo with a little rope, little twisted thing. So again, pre-internet, pre-digital, physically messengered over a New York Times article to our
No
office.
way. Like with a bike messenger?
I opened the interoffice envelope from HBO and wow, HBO is calling. Cool. And so she wanted us. And a year before, there was a famous case in the UK where a teenager was accused of, it's the Jamie Bolger case, where a toddler was killed on the railroad tracks in the UK, and it was caught by closed circuit TV. So, and actually I had tried to get access to that case, but couldn't. And Sheila wanted a kids killing kids film. And so we went down to Arkansas a week after the arrests thinking, gee, how could these three kids have become so disaffected with life and so brainwashed that they could take three 8-year-olds into the woods and sacrifice them to the devil. That was the film we started to make. And we embedded with the parents. So this is around June of 93. The trials weren't until, well, the first trial was January of 94 and then February of 94 for the second trial. And so we embedded ourselves in that town for about 6 months, thinking we were making a film about kids killing kids. And we became close to the parents of the victims. The first couple of months, we spent most of the time with them. And around November, we finally negotiated access to our first interviews with, well, we call them now the West Memphis Three, but back then they were just these rotten teenagers awaiting trial in prison for having done these horrible murders. And I had no reason to think otherwise. And so we sat down to do these interviews, and, 1 + 1 was not equaling 2. Like, I can't say after the first interviews, we said, oh my God, they're innocent. But there was this nagging feeling that something wasn't right.
Wow.
In particular, I
Wow.
remember the interview of Jason Baldwin,
Uh,
who had these tiny little wrists. And as I was interviewing him, I was imagining what the prosecution was alleging, which is that he took a 10-inch serrated hunting knife and he castrated one of the little boys and inflicted all of these horrible knife wounds. And I'm listening to him talk and I'm looking at his little wrist and I'm just thinking, something's not right. This is not right. And I remember calling up Sheila Nevins after these first interviews saying, with a lot of fear and trepidation, because Sheila Nevins is an obviously amazing executive at HBO. She almost more than anyone is responsible for the renaissance of documentaries in the 90s. You know, and
Yeah.
I remember calling her thinking she might cancel the film and tell us to come home if I told her it was not a kids killing kids film. And I remember calling her saying, I'm not sure I'm, you know, I'm not sure they're guilty. We're going to follow this thread. And I was half expecting her to say, no, I want a kids killing kids film, because she does have her salacious taste along with her highbrow taste. This is the one doing real sex and other shows like that. So, but
Yeah.
to her credit, she said, "Oh, that sounds even more interesting. If you think they may be innocent, stick with it." And we did. And
Wow. What a
we were
moment.
we were literally the only press that came out.
That's crazy.
I mean, all the press thought they were guilty. The trials were absurd. No physical evidence linking them to the crime. Their taste in music, including Metallica, which is what started the Metallica relationship. Uh,
Right.
you know, the Metallica lyrics were introduced into trial as evidence that they're murderers. So, it was really,
That's crazy.
so that's when I realized, so again, Brothers Keeper was more of an aesthetic experience of why I chose or why we chose a murder trial. And by the way, in Brothers Keeper, we were literally the first time cameras were allowed in a courtroom for a documentary. And it was just a bizarre coincidence. The one county that was having an experiment with cameras in the courtroom was Madison County in upstate New York, which was the jurisdiction for Brothers Keeper. So the whole
Wow.
thing was a bunch of coincidences. But
And there'd
when
never been a camera in the courtroom before?
for a feature doc, nope.
Wow.
Court TV was just starting to televise certain trials, but
Oh,
it
wow.
was state by state. Um, but for a documentary, we were the first. And
That's wild.
but it was watching those guys get chained up and sent off to prison, one to death row, where we were completely convinced of their innocence, that we're like, wow, we have the power to like hopefully change this outcome. And didn't realize it was going to take 2 more films and almost 20 years of
Yeah.
advocacy.
Yeah.
They finally were released, largely due to the films and the act. I should say the work of the activists and the lawyers, and there's a lot of people behind the scenes who actually did the work, so they deserve more of the credit. But the films definitely brought people in and catalyzed the effort to get them out.
Right.
I mean, Damien
So
himself, that he would have been dead, long dead, had we not made a film about it.
Wow. Wow.
so did is it fair to say that Paradise Lost kind of gave you that idea that true crime can be stories can be used as a vehicle for social justice?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I would, again, we didn't call it true crime then. That's just kind of a name
Right. What did
that's evolved.
they call it then?
Well,
What was it?
I just called it. I was a social justice documentarian who spent a lot of time in the criminal justice space, because
Right.
that film woke me up to wrongful convictions. And I've spent a lot of time doing stuff about wrongful convictions. I had a show for Lionsgate called Wrong Man, which we did several seasons of. I've done individual episodes on other people's series on wrongful conviction. I mean, my work has gotten six and a half people out of prison, meaning I've gotten 6
Wow.
people out of prison with my work. And one case, Richard Glossop, the original death penalty conviction was thrown out recently by the Supreme Court, but the horrible prosecutor in Oklahoma wants to retry the case despite overwhelming evidence of innocence. So he's not out of legal jeopardy yet. So, but at least
Wow.
his original penalty conviction has been overturned. And that's why, because I have such serious intent with crime, and it's not just about wrongful conviction, it's about, you
Right.
know, changing certain laws. It's about, you know, even the, you know, my shows have identified 5 new victims of serial killers. And
Wow.
one could, why is that important? Well, the only thing worse than losing a loved one from crime is not knowing what happened to them. So at least it brings an answer to families who don't know what happened to, you know, a long disappeared loved one, you know. So
Yeah.
I always ask myself, what needle can I move? What difference can I make? Why tell this story? Even the JonBenét Ramsey show, which was very popular on Netflix recently,
Yeah.
you know, the reason I did that is I got to know John Ramsay and became convinced that the parents have been maligned for decades as possible perpetrators of this horrible murder of their 6-year-old child, and nothing could be further than the truth. And it's because the Boulder police was so inept in how it handled the case and so corrupt in its leaking of false stories to the press that, you know, anyone who watched the news circa, you know, 1996, 97, you know, is, to this day, you know, if I ask a man on the street, hey, do you know about the JonBenét Ramsey case? They'll say, oh yeah, isn't that the case where the parents murdered their child?
Oh,
And
yeah.
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 the opposite is true. The Boulder police literally leaked false stories to the press implicating the parents that had no basis in fact, because they wanted to smoke the parents out and make them crack under pressure. That was their big technique, and you know, and so to me, that's a valid reason to retell that story, because you know, the real killer hasn't been caught. The family's been demanding, you know, that the Boulder police retest DNA for decades now. You know, DNA technology has so evolved since the original case. There's new investigative genetic genealogy, you know, 23andMe genealogy, which has caught a number of killers
Right.
recently. And so the family
Wow.
wants the stuff to be retested, and the Boulder police still refuses to test, which is crazy. When the show came out, they said they would test, but now they've gone radio silent.
Oh,
So
so that's the update. There's no testing yet. That's I was
no
gonna
test, no testing yet. But that's kind of the point. You know, like, you know, why tell that story? Well, I could just wallow in the original irresponsible story and make the parents look guilty for most of the show, or I could do something different and look at it with a 2025 lens. So that's why the word true crime bugs me, because there's a lot of really bad, irresponsible true crime. There's a lot of podcasts that make fun and have too much fun with the worst day of somebody's life.
Right,
Um,
right.
and, you know, and so the genre, you know, the genre has never been more popular, but it's also never been more polarizing, because a lot of people rightfully dislike some of the stuff that's made. But I also take issue with, there's certain people who hate anything in the crime realm, like nothing should be made in crime, which to me is dumb,
That's
you know,
interesting.
like, and if, you know, funny anecdote um, about how, you know, some people who just hate true crime can never be satisfied. They'll criticize it no matter what. Is I did Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes,
Yeah. Yeah.
around the same time that I did the movie with Zac Efron and Lily Collins, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, which was also about Ted Bundy. So,
Right.
and so Conversations with a Killer came out, and that film really dissects his mind and uses tapes to talk about, you know, what he was thinking and how he acted, and to tell the whole gory, horrible story. And so, of course, naturally, there was a lot of violence um, in the doc series. And so when that show came out, people criticized it as, oh, you're glorifying a serial killer by like torture porn, and you're talking about all the violence, and that's glorifying a serial killer, and why are we, who cares about this kind of thing? We shouldn't be making films about that. Then when Extremely Wicked came out, that film had no violence in it at all because it was from the POV of his girlfriend. In real life, Ted Bundy had a girlfriend played by Lily Collins named Liz Mulligan, who um, revered Bundy. Bundy was her live-in boyfriend who treated her really well. He was also a surrogate father figure to her daughter from another relationship. They both revered him. And so when he started being accused of these things and the police started closing in on him, her love, these two people couldn't believe it and did not believe that he was responsible. All of his friends thought he was being wrongfully accused. And so at the end of the movie, so you see no violence in the movie because you're seeing it from their POV, because the whole point of the film is to show how serial killers and how people who do evil gaslight the people around them to make them think they're good people, because that's the nature of evil. The people you least expect and most often trust are the ones who do the evil things, whether it's a priest who commits pedophilia or Bernie Madoff who, takes every last penny of widows, or a serial killer. They gaslight you. And so
Yeah.
when Extremely Wicked came out, that was criticized for glorifying a serial killer because we showed no violence. So Conversations was criticized for, glorifying a serial killer by showing the violence, and Extremely Wicked was criticized for glorifying the serial killer by not showing the violence. Like, okay, which is it? And the thing I have a problem, I definitely have a problem with irresponsible filmmaking that is irreverent in tone, disrespectful to victims. There is a group of true crime programming like that I disagree with. But to say we should not make films about serial killers, we should not make films about crime, to me is like, I don't understand that thought process, because unfortunately the only animal in the universe that kills for anything other than survival or to eat, which is survival, I guess, is man. Man is the only animal that kills for other reasons. And so it's part of the human condition. So we don't say,
Wow.
don't make, we don't say, don't make films about adultery. Don't make films about greed. Don't make films about love. These are all aspects of the human condition, but so is murder. So like, to say you shouldn't make those films, I have a problem with that group of people.
Who's saying that? Because it seems like people love true crime. Like you said, it's that genre is, a very popular genre, whatever we want to call it. But there's tons of it on
Well, no,
Netflix and everywhere.
it's extremely popular with viewers, and that's the bottom line. That's why it's getting made. But I do think amongst my documentary peers, there's a bit of snobbery and look down the nose at true crime. In
Mm.
part, I've heard other filmmakers say, like, gee, Netflix greenlighting so much true crime is taking the slot away from my political doc or from my doc about what, you name the subject. And that's a fundamental misread of the market. True crime is being greenlit because it's popular, and the business has matured to the point where a global streamer has 320 million subscribers. And just like rock and roll was revolutionary in the 60s and became very corporate in the 70s, and only popular music and only popular acts got signed, in the same way, like, all networks care about now, and you can analyze the reasons why, is, will this be a global hit? Will this travel to 320 million subscribers? It's not taking the slot of a more niche film. There was a time when Netflix was trying to, and streamers in general, but Netflix in particular, were building their bona fides. And so they would greenlight a lot more diverse kind of content, go to film festivals, acquire a doc, But now they make the calculus. Is this going to do well in Kazakhstan, Vienna, and London, as well as in the United States? And if they don't think it's going to be popular, they don't greenlight it. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding when people say, well, that true crime slot is taking away from my slot. It's really about,
That's
sadly,
crazy.
it's about
Yeah.
popular. And then critics go nuts over, over this stuff. A lot of, I mean, the Ted Bundy tapes was the number one show on Netflix when it came out. It was the number one doc series on Netflix that year in 2019. And I think it has
That
like a 55 on Rotten Tomatoes, so
Oh, really?
it,
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
I have,
That
so crime, and we could talk forever about Rotten Tomatoes too, like that whole
Yeah.
reductivist approach to film criticism.
I thought the
Whatever.
Ted Bundy
Anyway, look,
tapes, that was
sorry, go ahead.
phenomenal. Sorry, my internet's a little stodgy over here, but no, that conversations with Ted Bundy, I thought was phenomenal. Like, I
Yeah.
think having access to his voice and who he was, knowing what he did is just fascinating. I mean, I couldn't get enough of it, and I just thought it was a brilliant way of storytelling and showing insight to the character by just listening to them in this totally different way. It was so revealing.
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was incredibly responsibly done. You know, I
Yes.
re- I reached out to the victims to make sure they were okay with it, which I do on every show. I mean, I
Wow.
think I think my scripted counterparts on some of these shows don't reach out to the victims, which surprises me. But like, I always make sure. Sometimes the victims don't answer me, which I take. And when I say victims, often I mean the victim's family.
Uh-huh.
If I don't get a response back and I say I'm planning on doing this, A, do you want to participate? B, are you okay if we do this? If I don't get an answer back, I take that as a yes. They don't want to be in it, but it's okay to do it. Once in a while, people tell me like, please avoid this or don't do that, and I honor that. I've actually canceled. I canceled a movie because somebody said that if I did the story, it would ruin their life. There was a show called show.
Wow.
I was if you Google Facing the Wind, you'll see it's about 12 years ago. I can't remember exactly. Um, I was making a film about this famous case where a guy killed his whole family and was about to kill himself and was pulled out of put his head in the oven to kill himself after he killed his whole family because he had a mental breakdown. A neighbor pulled him out. He went to trial. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, but ended up getting out after 2 years, marries another woman. And the tension of the film is, will he kill again? Why did he kill? And I had a very outstanding cast, Vera Farmiga, Evan Rachel Wood, and Alessandra Nivola. We had a $5 million budget. And one of the people involved in the film, one of the major people who the story was about, even though she was the subject of the book and I had optioned the book, reached out and said, hey, if you do this, you're going to ruin my life. Basically, I've had issues with my daughter and we're finally have a good relationship. I'm in a new job. I've moved. If you do this, it'll just ruin my life. And so
Wow.
I said, well, let's talk in a couple of weeks. Let's talk. At the end, after about a month, she was still feeling this way. And so I canceled the film, because I felt like I
Wow.
Wow.
couldn't look at myself in the mirror knowing that someone said, you're going to ruin my life if you make this film, So,
Oh, I'm sure
um,
that was hard on many levels.
yeah, it was
That's
hard because
wow.
it's hard to get scripted movies made. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Joe,
is true.
Joe, I was going to ask you, you inspire so many filmmakers and so many people. Who inspires you?
I've had lots of influences. Of course, the Maisel brothers, the whole idea, which is so basic, but the whole idea that you can capture reality as it's unfolding and craft something that's as dramatic as a scripted film, i.e. cinema verite. You jump out a window and you hope there's a mattress on the other side to catch you. I mean, that whole way of thinking and philosophy, which we take for granted, that was kind of, blew my mind when I first encountered it. I spent the first 5 years of my career working for them, more as their marketing guy, getting them TV commercial work. That was my real job. Because I started my career as an ad agency producer. I was a very young
Wow.
producer, and we hired the Maisel brothers to shoot a Real People commercial. And then I hit it off with David Maisels, who invited me to come work for them and get them more commercials because they liked the money, as do all. Making commercials back then was a way that many, including myself, for the first 10 years of my career, making commercials was how you supplemented your income, because documentaries weren't the big business that they eventually became. So the whole Maisels philosophy of verite, which, by the way, is one of my great laments of the state of documentary now. It is so hard to get a verite film greenlit by a streamer these days. There's just no faith in following a story. Like, you always hear, well, what's the production budget? What's the schedule? How's it going to end? And of course, you can't answer those questions. That's the magic of verite. Not once at HBO did Sheila Nevins, in 20 years of making 3 Paradise Lost films, not once did she say, well, when are you handing it in? And, what's the ending going to be? It's like, I understand the pressure the executives are under, and it's a very competitive world out there, but I think there's room for, if it's a good filmmaker and it's a good topic, like a little more risk taking in supporting a filmmaker, because all the great verite films now are made by first and second time filmmakers, and shouldn't just say that, but filmmakers who are willing to make a film without financial support from a network. They just figure out how to cover a great story, and they follow it 5 years, 2 years, whatever. And then it shows up at a festival and it's a great film. Last year's crop of Academy Award nominees often were first films by filmmakers who were just had to make a film, No Other Land, Porcelain War. So all the great, and again, there are great films out there, not, that don't fall into this rule, but generally speaking, most of the good verite films are happening independently by people who are just having to make a film and don't know how to get financial support in advance. And the green lighting by networks of verite films is like dying on the vine. And I think it's really
That's so interesting.
very
Well, well, when I went through your filmography, which I had so much fun doing, by the way, but it did make me think, like, oh, your early films were verite. It was following the action. You showed up, you didn't know what the outcome was going to be, or that you'd be filming for 20 years in Arkansas. And
Yeah,
now
that's the type of filmmaking I love, and I have not made a verite film in years. Again, I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me. I have an overall with Netflix. They've treated me incredibly well. I love what I
right,
do. The combination of me with Netflix in the true crime space has really produced
it's
audiences
phenomenal. Yeah.
audiences I couldn't have imagined having had. When Brothers Keeper went to Sundance, won the audience award, but we couldn't get arrested for distribution. So Bruce and I self-distributed the film ourselves. And
Oh,
if
wow.
400, if 400 people saw the movie in a movie theater in a weekend, we would high five each other. Oh my God, 400 people saw our movie. And now I put something out on Netflix, and, tens and tens and tens of millions of people see it. So that's extraordinary. So
Wow.
this is not a complaint about Netflix. But I do feel a little bit of a loss within myself that I have not been, I have not made a verite film. What was the last verite film I made? I think about oh yeah, I made a film, about a surfer named Robbie Nash, who was setting out to break the world record, on stand-up paddleboard. Um, and which is, obviously more of a pop culture thing. And that film, uh, one of the screenings was at a sports film festival, I think called CineQuest, if I remember correctly, in San Jose. It it was on it was on the festival circuit, and this is February or maybe March of 20. And the head of the festival said, "We're not sure we're going to show your film tonight because we may be shutting down the festival because of COVID, but hopefully we'll show the film."
Oh, no.
In fact, they showed the film, and that was the last film of the festival. It was opening weekend, so the festival was 10 days long. I,
Oh,
so
that's
they
such
they
a bummer.
they closed the festival. We all went home to our COVID misery. In fact, this guy was very popular in the film was sponsored by Red Bull, and this guy is very popular in Europe. And we had a whole European theatrical release set up, and that all got canceled. So my last Verite film kind of went out with a whimper
Oh,
because
man. You need to
literally
do
have not,
another one.
I literally have not made a Verite film since then, because that's around COVID is when my deal with Netflix started. And again, I have a great relationship with Netflix. We've done some bold things together. Uh, but I wish everyone would be have more meaning all commissioners of programming would have more confidence in a verite film where you don't know how it ends. You don't know how long it's going to take, but if the filmmaker has a good track record and there's a good inciting incident that makes sense to follow, those are always the best films. I mean, that's what brought me into documentary, the immediacy
Yeah.
of, I mean, in some ways, the fact that I've become like the king of documentary recreations in the crime space is like, if I could go back to my 10, younger self of 10 years ago, I would have been like, recreations? Are you kidding? I'm a Maisels brothers disciple, very filmmaker. Are you kidding? Recreations? Again, I'm very proud of the work. I've attracted audiences the size of which I couldn't even have dreamt about in my early days of being in the business. But I do wish there was greater sensitivity and interest in giving good filmmakers who have a track record, uh, which should give them the assurance that a film will be done and, within budget, but you just can't say when it's going to be done or how it turns out. So I
Right.
wish there was more of an appetite for verite.
Yeah, I mean, I think the retrospectives, I guess, is that what you call them, or recreations or retrospective type of films? I mean, they're certainly enjoyable, and you can, like, you can feel your stamp on it. But like the verite, you're right, that was like your DNA, literally your blood, your sweat, your tears, your DNA is on that film, whereas you definitely feel the Joe Berlinger, stamp on the other ones. It's just different because it's more, like you said, you're piecing it together versus exploring the unknown.
Yeah. It's
It's a
more of a
different,
commercial. I mean, I hate to use the word, but it's more of a commercial approach to storytelling, the current
right?
vibe. And that's the
Sure.
other thing, a little, the other trend is that even in crime, because you're appealing to, a worldwide audience, the tendency is to greenlight stories that have name recognition. Bundy, JonBenét, Tylenol murders we did recently. Um, the lesser known stories or the newer stories, there's a lot more hesitation about greenlighting because they want to know that somebody all over the world will at least have some passing knowledge of the case so that they'll tune in, you know.
Well, wasn't Making of the Murderer, that was sort of verite, right? On Netflix. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, yeah, no, that
It
was
was a
a that was a breakthrough. The Making of a Murderer was a breakthrough show for the continued,
yeah.
that and the podcast serial. That's when you really saw crime programming, you know, just hit the roof.
So how do you come to Netflix with ideas, or do they come to you and say, "Hey, Ted Bundy,"
A
like
little
how
of
how
both.
does that work?
A little of both. We have regular development meetings and we pitch ideas, and then they pitch us things they're thinking about for us to look into, like one of the recreation shows that actually I love and feel like we really pushed the envelope on was a show we did about Bernie Madoff, um, where we actually put the interview subjects on the set of the recreation, and we did some really interesting visual handoffs between the interviews and the recre. So I think from a aesthetic standpoint, that show really was innovative. And that's an example of uh, Netflix saying to me, after I said, "Hey, can we start looking at other things besides, you know, murder? Because it's a lot." Like if you look at my IMDb page before my Netflix deal, I'm a pretty well-rounded filmmaker. Well, Tony Robbins, Robbie Nash, the surfer, Metallica, Paradise Law. Like I'm covering an array of things. My favorite thing on TV that I ever worked on was Iconoclast for the Sundance Channel. We did 6 seasons
Oh
of that show,
yeah, love that.
which I loved. I couldn't believe that I was getting paid to like go travel Sean Penn back up to the bus in Alaska, where for his story Into the Wild, and or sitting on a beach with Laird Hamilton and Eddie Vedder, because Laird Hamilton was teaching Eddie how to surf on Maui. I mean, that series, I was like, I giggled at myself back at the hotel room. Oh, I'm getting paid to do this. So I love that show,
Those are great. I remember those. I've seen those
but
too.
but but like if you look at my IMDb page for the last 6 years, it's like murder, killer, killer, murder, cold case with a Nazi theme in there. I did do 6 hours on Hitler
Just
and the
some
Nazis, so which is murder on a global scale, but at least it's history. At least it's history that I'm interested in. I forgot the point I was trying to make, but I do wish
You were well-rounded before Netflix, and now Netflix wants to
I had
give
more
you more. But you
verite.
did Madoff. You did Madoff. You talked
Oh,
about
Madoff,
that
right? So
in
that was an example of Netflix. Sorry, that's right. Thank you for. You see, I'm very long-winded. We'll need another hour and a half.
This is
Um,
what I mean. We could talk to you for hours. I love this.
Um, Madoff was an example of where Netflix said to me, "Hey, well, what about financial crime? What do you think of Bernie Madoff?" And I'm like, "Okay, interesting. Let me see how I can tackle that and make it accessible and interesting to a larger group." Jeff Hutchins, who has shot a lot of my stuff in the last 5 or 6 years, did an amazing job, is really great at lighting. I miss Bob Richmond, who has retired, but Bob, of
Oh,
course.
he
Bob
retired? Bob retired? No.
more or less retired.
Oh,
You know,
no.
but
I
Bob
wanna
was
bring him
my.
on the show.
You should. Bob is the master of verite. Bob shot Paradise Lost, Metallica, Some Kind of Monster. The Robbie film. Just so many. Like
I'm a
he
big
was.
fan of Bob's. We gotta bring him on the show.
Yeah, you got to bring Bob on the show.
He's a
Bob's the best.
classic. He's the
He
best.
has he has shot some of the greatest verite films ever made.
I didn't know he retired. I mean, Al Maisels, I used to see him I was just telling somebody this the other day. I used to see Al popping out of the subway with his little camera tucked under his arm, like he filmed till, he in his 80s,
Well,
just running around.
maybe I'm speaking out of school. I think he doesn't like going away on long adventures anymore, but I'm sure he still works.
Oh,
But it's more like, kind of day work and, you know,
ah,
local kind of stuff. But you can talk to him about it. But he's the
I
best.
will. He's the
Uh,
best.
yeah. Learned a lot from Bob.
Bob is the best for sure. So I have a question. I have worked on murder shows. And by the way, it was along the social justice uh part side of things, and I felt it was called In Pursuit for John Walsh, and we were chasing fugitives that were on the run. So we would tell the story of what happened and
Hmm.
then use the audience, to send in tips and try and track down these cases that were still live. And then it was just unbelievable because I there was two units, the recreation side and the documentary unit side. And I got to do the documentary unit side, and I was working with the victims or the families of the victims, which was an incredible experience. to tell their story. And in one case in particular, I had this woman's, she was severely beaten by a boyfriend that she tried to break up with. She was in a coma for 5 months and had brain damage and lost vision in her eye. It was horrible, horrible, horrible. But I was given the crime photos from the detective, and got to tell her story, which was a very intimate process because she lived. She almost died, and she was able to live. And this guy was on the run. And anyway, those photos, I think I still have those photos because they were the most gruesome things I've ever seen in my life, but it was sort of a visual reminder of, like, why we're doing this story. We were there to tell her story, to be able
Yeah.
to try and track this guy down, and we did. The viewers recognized this guy who the crime happened in Texas. They recognized him in Florida, I think it was, or Atlanta. No, I think it was Florida. And they caught him and brought him to jail, and that happened several times on that show, and it was the most gratifying experience that I had in this business, or one of the most, gratifying experiences, of being able to help solve that crime through the storytelling. And,
Yeah.
and this woman, I gave her my personal phone. She texted me every day for, like, years. Me and the detective every morning, "Hello, it's Mary. I'm alive." It was like, wow, it was so intense. You know, and that was just, like, one story that still lives with me today. I still have those photos. It's in my brain. Like, it's intense to deal with that
Yeah.
kinda story material. And you've been doing it for a very long time. Like, how do you protect yourself, or what do you do with that hard material in your mind? Like, how do you manage
Yeah.
that basically? Because it's not easy.
It's not. It's a great point, and congrats on you being a part of something that moved the needle. I'll say two things. One is, which is something I don't talk about that often, um, but I had a really horrible childhood with an abusive father, uh, and part of my social justice instinct is kind of exorcising the horrors of that kind of a childhood. So there's a part of me that feels like it's very healthy for me to give a voice to the voiceless because I didn't have that when I was little, and not so little. So that's part one. Part two is it does take a toll. I remember Bruce and I were editing Paradise Lost in Manhattan. We were still, even though digital was still happening, we were still digital editing. We were still cutting. We shot all the behind the scenes material on 16 millimeter film, and we shot the trial on video. So we were cutting on both film and digital. It was a very complicated edit back then. Um,
Wow.
un- we made it unnecessarily difficult in part because Bruce was hesitant about getting into digital editing. So in part, it was like he knows how to physically edit film, and so we're going to edit parts of the film on film. Anyway, the point is, we were spending, things take longer when you're editing on film. And there was a particular couple of days where we were trying to figure out how much crime scene footage to include in the film. The film famously opens with the police crime scene video of the
Yeah.
kids' bodies, which at the time was
Right.
super controversial. A lot of people heaped tons of criticism on the film for showing that. We had our reasons, which included to understand how a town could be so fearful and be so fooled by horrible police work. You had to understand how scared everyone was and how much they needed an answer because the crime was so horrible. And to situate the audience in that horror by showing that footage was one of the reasons we did it. I mean, now what we show is tame by today's standards, but back then, a minute of crime scene footage in the opening title sequence was a bold choice. So it was that week that we were like looking at footage, looking at autopsy photos, looking at things that just people shouldn't spend time looking at, just horrible stuff. Cause these kids were
Yeah.
photos were rough. And so I remember, I live an hour away. So I remember, driving home, and I had a 9-month-old child in a crib at the time. My older daughter, Sarah, who's now 31. So shows you
Wow.
time, time, time flies. But, I remember, I remember going into her nursery and dropping the arm of the crib. So, and picking her up and wanting to have this like, innocent fatherly new father, first child, moment. And while I'm holding my kid, I'm flashing on all these horrible images that I had seen in the edit room.
Oh,
And I just
gosh.
really resented the project because it just, yeah, I had stared into the abyss of evil, and the last thing I wanted to do was to be thinking about it while I'm holding my precious little 9-month-old baby. And
Oh,
put her down, and it really bothered me. And so, uh, I went out and I got myself a good luck charm. How I decided what was my good luck charm is too boring a story, but I got something that represents you know, that I keep in my pocket, uh, to this day. And when I go into my home, I take it out and I put it in a little ashtray, and that to me
oh,
represents the work. And when I'm home, I don't think about the work, and when I go back out into the world, I take that little good luck charm and put it back in my pocket. And so that for me was kind of a ritual that trained my brain to stop thinking about the horrors when I'm at home and with my family.
that's
Wow.
incredible.
Wow.
That is so powerful because and so important because as the messenger, you're absorbing all these things and having to be, empathetic with the victim or victims' families. You're just dealing with even the detectives. I think what they go through is um misunderstood or not very understood, but they see it all day every day too, and it's extremely hard. I've seen that up and close and personal. Like the detective that I worked with, he went to the hospital every single day that this woman was in a coma, and this was months. He went, and so for him to solve that case, it just meant the world for him. And so you deal with this stuff, and it's not your everyday kind of thing. And so that's great that you have a tool, a protective tool, so that
Yeah.
you can be the messenger.
Yeah. Yeah. And the one thing that my kids tease me about, uh, which hasn't, the good luck charm hasn't stopped this kind of thinking, is that I have seen so much bad. Like when my daughter says, "Hey, I'm walking home," or she'll text us, "I'm walking home from a party and it's 11 o'clock at night and she's in Boston." I'm like, "Take an Uber, don't walk home," or when when my other kid, wanted to solo travel, it's like, no, no, you have to have somebody. So it has made me a very paranoid. Seeing what I've seen has made me a very
I
paranoid.
bet.
Often
Well,
my
you
kids,
have
often my
yeah.
kids, dad, get a grip,
Well, you have
You're right.
a you have a pretty nuanced view of evil in the world, right? It's when especially it's hard to imagine when you see these crime photos, of this woman, Mary Ramos, it sticks in my brain, but when you see these crime photos, it's just kind of it's so hard to imagine how that could happen, how somebody would inflict this type of, you know, horror on somebody else. And this was her boyfriend.
Yeah,
She broke up with him because he was a little creepy, and I think he just wouldn't go away. Like he wasn't respecting her boundaries. And she was
yeah,
like, "Hey, I don't want to date you anymore." And he came back and beat her. It's like
yeah.
it's just unbelievable what somebody could
You know,
do. And
yeah. I mean, that's why, getting back to what I was saying earlier, that's why it bugs me when people say, well, we just don't make films about serial killers. They're horrible, evil people, and there's no value to doing it. Well, I disagree. It's like, cautionary tale type of material.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because, I mean, for example, what started me on the Bundy journey, which was both Conversations with the Killer and the Zac Efron movie, but then the Bundy thing did so well. I've done now 5 seasons of Conversations with the Killer, Gacy, Dahmer, Son of Sam, and there's another one coming out. In fact, it's the longest running doc series on Netflix is
It's
Conversations.
so good.
Wow.
Yeah.
But the reason I started that is I was thinking about doing Bundy tapes. I mean, the whole thing was like this guy reached out to me who had interviewed Bundy in 1989 for a book called uh, Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer. Shortly before he was executed, he did kind of one of the last interviews with Bundy on death row, recorded it on audio tapes, published the
That's
book in
wild.
89, and then in 2018, many years later, he cold called me and said, a big fan of your work. And I was cleaning out my closet and I found these tapes on Bundy that I used when I was, writing the book. Is there any value to them? Do you think there's a show
Oh
here?
my gosh.
I'm very skeptical. I'm like, well, Bundy, kind of a well-worn tire. I don't know. Let me listen to them. So he sent me the tapes and the perspective and I mean, look, he's an unreliable narrator too, and he's not always accurate, and often dissembling, but if you can contextualize it, that's also interesting. But I've never seen such a unadorned, clear-eyed assessment of one's own actions in those tapes. And I thought, yeah, I think there is something here. So I was contemplating doing it. And it was at Thanksgiving, and one of my daughters was, I have 2 very bright daughters. I know I sound like a proud father, but I am. But
Aw, you should be.
one daughter was about to enter MIT, and the other daughter was about to graduate from Columbia on her way to get a master's and PhD at Berkeley. So my two
Nice.
my 2 very bright young women were sitting around a Thanksgiving table, and I said, "Do you guys know who Ted Bundy is?" No, no. The serial killer Ted Bundy preyed upon long-haired collegiate girls that kind of look like you. No, never heard of them. And I said, okay, that's interesting. Text some of your friends, and their friends are very bright people. And one person said, "Oh, isn't he a baseball player?" I mean,
Oh
like
my gosh.
my daughter's generation had no idea who Ted Bundy is, and
Wow.
the lesson of Ted Bundy, if you could boil it down, is just because someone is charming and good looking and white, it doesn't mean you should just implicitly trust them. And
Right.
so for me, that's reason enough to put that story out because that was the year also that some young woman got into an Uber and the Uber driver was posing to be an Uber driver and she was murdered. So in this era
Right.
of era of catfishing and people presenting an image of themselves online, which may or may not be true. To me, what better lesson to put out to my daughter's generation than to scare the shit out of them that you shouldn't just
Yeah.
implicitly trust somebody, because that's how those women went to their death. He'd walk into the
Right.
University of Washington library with a fake cast on and a stack of books, and then he'd ask some young unsuspecting woman to help him carry the books to his car, and then he would knock them over the head and kill them.
Wow.
So
Unbelievable. Yeah.
to me, it's a cautionary tale. And the other misconception we have about serial killers, which is why people say, well, just don't make films about them. Um, we want to think that serial killers act like serial killers 24/7, that they look creepy, they sound creepy, that they emerge from the shadows with, blood dripping from their mouth. And want to feel this way because somehow um, it gives us the false reassurance that you won't become a victim to a serial killer because you can identify them. But the opposite
Right.
is the people who do evil in the world, who are the people you least expect and most often trust, whether it's a priest who commits pedophilia, or, Bernie Madoff taking Elie Wiesel's, money, a guy who survived the Holocaust, or a serial killer. Ted Bundy was beloved by all his friends. And so to me, realistic portrayals of how people operate is important,
Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's not what you think. And the reverse is true for, just any kind of like assumptions. And talking about Berkeley real quick, Professor Offshee was my professor. Is that hilarious? So, Sean, he was in Paradise Lost. He was on the trial and he was a witness expert, right? About a false confession that Jesse Miss Kelly made, right? Is that right? Do I have that right?
Mhm.
So Jesse Miss Kelly had a low IQ and he was easily coerced into making a false confession. But Professor Offshee was like, no, this is a classic case of like a false confession. And he was my professor. And it was because I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad. And it was like a crime and social control class, I think it was. And I asked him if I could go to San Quentin death row, and I was gonna interview people on death row. I just was
Wow.
fascinated with this
Wow.
and wanna do it, and he's like, "No." He said, "That's crazy, you're nuts, you cannot do that."
Oh,
So I
too
would have
bad.
had those tapes. I would have had confessions
Oh man.
of a killer tapes from college. But I have murder on the brain. But you do music. You do murder and music.
I know. I know. I wish I did more music.
What's
I've
what's
What
what's
is
I'll say, what's next on the horizon for you? Is there any more possible Metallica type docs in the future, or anything outside of that murder genre?
Yes, I'll be honest, I've pitched a few music films to Netflix that they've passed on. I mean, the bar for them is very high. I think the kind of artists they're looking to do, like kind of these global pop stars, is not necessarily the kind of music I would want to explore. So, again, not bashing Netflix at all. I understand the need to appeal to, when Netflix had 100 million subscribers, it's different than their current 320 million around the world. So, I get it, but one of these days I'll get a music film going. I
Yeah.
do miss it.
Yeah.
I did Paul Simon, Under African Skies, which was a great experience. Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, which we haven't talked about, but was an incredible life
Ah,
experience.
I love that
Great.
film.
Yeah.
Um,
Great movie. Great movie.
and I did a film about gospel music that I love. But yeah, no, I need to do another music film, a palate cleanser.
Yeah.
A
Can we
palate cleanser.
can we talk about the Metallica one real quick? It sounded like you met them through the West Memphis 3 experience and then built that relationship and trust. And how did that all come about?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Metallica film is a big happy accident that all worked out, and the reason the film feels so authentic was that it was never meant to be. It just kind of happened, and specifically, when we were cutting Paradise Lost, at that time, Metallica had not ever licensed music to a film, was very, um, you know, anti-licensing, commercial licensing of its music. That's what was its stance at the time. So we knew the bar was very high to get it. We didn't even think we could get it, but we started dropping in Metallica music, in particular, three songs. See if I can remember them. Call of Cthulhu, Orion, and Enter Sandman were the
Oh,
three songs. And
Oh, yeah.
Metallica music to those who like their music, and I count among them. Uh, you know, the tracks are very long and have very distinct sections, and sometimes you can have a very melodic opening and then go into thrash metal riffs, and so one particular track, feels like four different songs in some ways. And so we liberally used three different songs throughout the entire rough cut. thinking we'll never get this music and we're going to have to hire a composer to do some metal knockoff to make it sound like Metallica, because we knew that was the vibe we wanted.
Yeah.
But I reached out to Metallica's manager. I didn't know them at all. So this is now 95. I was always an early adopter of technology, so I had one of those brick cell phones in my car, like
Yeah.
big telephone with the brick, like I was like in the military field phone or something. But I had sent a fax to Cliff Bernstein at Q Prime, and I said, hey, this is who we are. Our previous film of Brother's Keeper. Here's some, it was well reviewed. Now we're doing Paradise Lost. Metallica lyrics were introduced into trial of this murder trial in Arkansas. And we really want to use the music because heavy metal music is on trial as much as these kids are. They literally are saying in this trial that because these teenagers listen to Metallica music, it made them killers, which is absurd on so many levels. Anyway, I gave it my all, thinking I'd never hear from them. Oh yeah, what are these guys these guys, just kind of falling for the cliches of heavy metal bands, thinking they could give two shits about this kind of an endeavor. And I was driving home, and lo and behold, my brand new brick cell phone that I had just gotten, I barely knew how to use it, rang in my car, and it's Cliff Bernstein, the manager of Metallica, who has since become one of my dearest friends over the years.
Oh, wow.
He said, "Oh my God, the band loves Brothers Keeper. A Brothers Keeper poster they put up in the rehearsal room." It's like, are you
What?
kidding?
Wow.
So they were fans of the first film, which was shocking to hear. And secondly, they're like, yeah, send us a rough cut. We're totally open to it. Sounds like an important film. We sent them a rough cut. And Lars, the drummer, and I in particular developed a really nice rapport and friendship, which is quite strong still today.
Oh, great.
And they were totally down with it. And in fact, they did not charge us because they didn't want to create the precedent of licensing their music. And in fact, now they have, and they do it all the time. But in those years, they were very like, no. So not only did they let us use all that music that we had laid in, which was a liberal use of 3 songs, they also did not charge us a penny for it. In fact, for all 3 films, we used only Metallica music, and they did not charge us anything.
Wow.
So they were really the first people in. A lot of celebrities like Johnny Depp and Eddie Vedder and Natalie Maines, deservedly so, get a lot of the attention for stepping up to help the West Memphis 3. But Metallica really were the first people in and really helped make that film super successful. So cut to, it's now the year 2000, and they were going into the studio to record their first record in 5 years. And as a favor to the band, they asked me to come out. In fact, Bruce and I had kind of parted ways. He wasn't a part of this initial thing. Bruce and I were having trouble being a partnership, which is an issue, in filmmaking co-directors, which we'll save for another podcast. But we were kind of going our separate ways, and Lars asked me to come out and document. Basically they just wanted a little B-roll of them going into the studio because physical CDs were still selling really well, but digital music was starting to nip at the heels of the music industry. It hadn't yet overturned it, but it was starting to nip at the heels. And so record labels were wanting to put value added things on a CD to make them sell over a digital option. So the idea was it was going to be a dual disc where there'd be a 20-minute little featurette of Metallica behind the scenes of recording a record.
That's so
cool.
cool.
And I went out by myself. Bruce wasn't a part of it. And I landed in San Francisco, and I called Lars, and he said, "Oh, I forgot you were coming. Band's in deep trouble. The bassist just quit. The management is bringing in a shrink to try to, talk." And I'm like, "Shrink? Talk us through?" And somehow I just somehow I pushed my way through and, found myself at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco in a hotel room filming this first session thinking, oh my God, I don't know how the universe put me here, but this is amazing. And in fact, I realized I needed, because Bruce and I had kind of broken up and it wasn't handled that well. And there was some raw feelings. And I realized that he and I could use the making of this film to actually heal our own relationship. Here we have the
Oh,
icons of
wow.
male testosterone, working through their
In
collaborative
therapy.
issues. And you think, oh my God, Bruce has got to be a part. This is we didn't know what it was going to turn into. So Bruce came in and we ended up spending 3 years every other week going to San Francisco, more or less, documenting this. And it was
Wow.
really never intended to be the film that it became. And Bruce and I used it to repair our relationship and to figure out how to collaborate. The
Did
problem
you
was
guys did you guys use the therapist too?
we didn't literally use him, but at night we'd go back to our hotel rooms and talk about our own issues and what caused our breakup. And, basically, if
Aw.
boil it, and Bruce is a wonderful human being and I miss him dearly, and we went on to collaborate on other stuff. But, in the early days, nobody would hire one of us without the other because we were a team. And I just felt like me more than him, to be honest, like, which says something about my own fragile ego, not his. He was the more secure one. But I just always felt like, gee, every time we're up for a job, whether it's a commercial or a film or whatever, it's either both of us or none of us as the directors. And I just, at that young age in my career, I just felt like I don't want to be dependent upon somebody else to get a job, and that we should each develop our own careers. So that was the reason I started pushing away. And, I don't think in hindsight, I didn't handle it great. And so when this film came back around and it was an opportunity to actually talk about it in a much healthier way, it was actually incredibly healing for both of us, which was, really wonderful.
That's incredible. I did not know that part of the story. That is so incredible.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you guys were able to work it out and the
Yeah. No.
band too. I
Yeah.
love that these heavy metal guys go to therapy. I mean, it's just awesome. Uh,
Yeah,
is it
no. It was a life-changing film for me, I needed to hear that message at the time. I've come to realize, not to be too zen about it or whatever. People say, well, how do you pick your films? What are your, and of course there's a process of where I think I'm in control or whatever, but actually the magic in my life and the magic in my career, I think, has been the films choosing me at the moment I needed the lesson, as opposed to me choosing the films. Because certain films you think are going to happen, and you just knock your head against the wall, and sometimes and they don't happen. And then certain films, like, the doors open, and, like, of course you're working. It's not like it's just you can sit back and, wait for things to happen. So you have your part to do. But the films that work out, it just sometimes I just feel like these magic doors just kind of open, and something that you can't imagine is actually happening. And I've come to realize that, like, that's the lesson I needed to hear in my life at that time. I can tell you every important film, which we'll do the next time.
yeah.
every every important film of mine, that when I say important to me, uh,
Right.
you know, came at a time when I needed to hear that lesson in my life. And that's what I so appreciate about, having been done this job. I mean, I can't, I'm 64. I just turned 64. I've been making films since I was
Oh.
28. So since I was 28 years old, I've been, like, getting paid, sometimes not great, in the early days, but raised my children and raised a family and had a career,
That's
like, dropping into other people's lives and experiencing things I never could have imagined as a abused child, at home, that I would ever get to see or do. So it's been pretty incredible. I
you
have to say.
you have had an incredible, incredible career, and we were so
Yeah.
grateful for your your work and your imprint on the work, because it does feel like a Joe Berlinger show, whatever it is, it does feel like you're behind it. And, I
Well,
think we all
I,
appreciate that so much.
I appreciate
And
that.
whether it's murder or music, we're going to watch it whenever. We can't wait for the next film.
Put a good murder story in the music industry.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
Two birds.
Yeah.
Does that exist? I don't
Phil
know. I can't
Spector.
think about anything
Oh,
off
yeah,
the
there's a
top of my
couple of
head.
juicy murders in the music industry,
Yeah.
for sure.
Ooh, there you go. There you go, Netflix. We got Joe's next film.
Cool.
All
All right. Well,
right, well,
nice to see
Joe.
you again after all these years.
Oh my God, this is ridiculous. We should get together and have a drink. Well, it's been
Right.
lovely talking to you. Thank you
Same
so
here. Nice to
much.
meet you, Dawn. And
Yes, we will. We'll keep you
oh,
posted.
all right. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.